everyone. Welcome to the ANA eLearning Academy. Tonight we have Joe Boling, who's going to be presenting on more on paper money, counterfeits, and the history of official counterfeiting. If you have any questions during this, you will be muted, so please put them in the Q&A or in the chat, and I will read them to Joe at the end. Joe, go ahead.
Hello, good evening. I'm Joseph Boling. I'm a 47-year member of the ANA, a 51-year member of the International Banknote Society, and a 55-year collector of paper money. Specializing in various things through the years, but now my specialty is counterfeit paper money and genuine notes to go with them. If you read the intro to this course, you saw that it invited you to watch the one that we did last year, which was the course on printing technologies and introduction to counterfeit paper money. We're picking up from there where we left off. And when we finished that one, when we ran out of 2 hours, we were in the middle of a slide set of how do counterfeiters evade the security features in the banknotes that they're trying to replicate. We're going to take up where we left off in that slide set, complete that, and then start through and hopefully finish a slide set on official counterfeiting. Although when I rehearsed this last night, I didn't get all the way through that set. I'm going to lower the screen on my laptop and turn off the video, if I can figure out how to turn off the video here. Alright, so the first set of notes that we have is from Indochina right after World War II. This is a note that was printed by Thomas Delarue and circulated in Indochina and counterfeited twice. Two different counterfeiting operations replicated this note, and we're going to look at both of them. The security feature in this note, in addition to the Intaglio printing, is a watermark in this watermark window, and we'll look and see how the counterfeiters worked their way around the watermark. They didn't attempt to work their way around the Intaglio printing. The printing is either a lithography or letterpress, I don't remember which, on each of the two counterfeits. If you did not go back and review the previous session, Intaglio is the fancy name for engraved printing. Printing from an engraved plate which leaves ink standing up on the surface of the paper in the areas where the ink is prominent. When the note is new, you can actually feel that with your finger or your thumb and feel the ink standing up on the surface of the paper. These tints, the pink tint here and the orangish tint over here, those are all lithographed. And of course the serial numbers and the block numbers are letterpress as well. Well, not as well, we haven't talked about letterpress yet, but those are letterpress. Alright, here's the first counterfeit. It's a fairly good reproduction of the original note. And here's the second counterfeit. We only ever encounter this with this French word faux, or faux, which means false, rubber stamped on the note. This note has never been seen without this rubber stamp, so I suspect what happened here was the counterfeiters got caught before they distributed any. All of their notes were overprinted or stamped with this rubber stamp and put in some archive someplace, and eventually they trickled out into collectors' hands. This other counterfeit here is much more scarce. You almost never see that counterfeit. This counterfeit is fairly common. Alright, here's the watermark in the genuine note, and this is what I call a black and white watermark. It has dark elements and light elements, and every shade in between. It's a complex watermark, which is made when the paper is made. It's embedded in the paper. It's not printed on the paper. The counterfeiters, of course, did not have access to this kind of paper, so they had to figure out a way to simulate that watermark. Well, here's the first one, the better of the two, or the scarcer of the two counterfeits. And you can barely see an outline of a face in here and the headdress up here in this corner. It's not a very good replication of the watermark. It's just enough that a frazzled retail clerk who holds the note up to a light and looks in that watermark window can see, oh yeah, there's something in that window, so the note passes. Here's the other replica watermark, and you can see the outline in white of the image that we saw in dark lines in the original. This image here, everything that's dark here is actually light in this one. And again, it's just a matter of putting something in that window so a person who's wanting to check the watermark to see if the note is real will see something in that window and accept it, not realizing just how poor it looks. So how is this done? By printing on the back of the note. Now in this case, the printed on watermark is actually darker than the paper. If you recall, when we looked at that back here, everything was lighter. So that tells us that what they've used is a greasy ink, which makes the paper translucent because of the oil in the ink. This probably was not very visible when it was printed 75 years ago. But over time, that greasy ink has is oxidized and turned color so that now it's visible to the naked eye on the back of the note. Now over here in this one, the one that had the light watermark, you can see the lightness in the watermark element here, and that's created by printing this pattern across the watermark window and varying the density of the ink in the pattern so that in some places less ink is applied, the lines are less bold, and you get the light pattern showing. This probably wasn't invisible when it was first printed. It probably was the shade you're seeing now, because if you remember, we had the same kind of shading on the face of the note as well. And it's possible that these were linked, that the shading on the face also is variable to give you white elements instead of dark elements, and that they were well aligned so that it looked the same from either side. So this is how these two counterfeiters tried to evade the issue of putting a watermark in their paper. Here's another note from the same period, right after the war. It's in the French Polychrome technique. Polychrome meaning multicolor. The French Polychrome technique is mostly letterpress. All of these individual colors are separately printed on this note in letterpress. No lithography. After the war, the French began to put a little bit of intaglio into the notes. In this case, the intaglio is the hair on these three ladies, the counters up here on both corners, and this text across the top. That's an intaglio. That's all the intaglio that, well, this cent piastres probably is also intaglio. The numerals, of course, are always in letterpress. Now, this has a watermark of an elephant's head. And it's a little bit hard to make out the elephant's head here without light shining through it. But the watermark is so bold that even lying on a tabletop, you can see these lumpy areas, evidence of something being in that paper. You don't even have to hold it up to a light to believe that in fact there is a watermark in that paper. There's a close-up of it. Now, the counterfeit is all letterpress and lithography. It's not, they didn't use the French Polychrome technique, and there's no intaglio. So this hair on the ladies is not intaglio, and these counters and this text is not intaglio. And you can see that the counterfeit is a somewhat lower quality of artwork, but it's good enough to pass as long as you can convince a recipient that there's something in the watermark window. Well, what they did here was they embossed the watermark into the paper. They took a die with this pattern on it and pressed it hard into that paper, probably with the paper moistened, probably with heat applied as well, and compressed the paper in a pattern here so that you still get the impression, sitting on a desk, you can still see that there's something in that watermark window, even if you don't pick up the note and examine it closely. The problem with embossing for watermarks is that it doesn't change the amount of paper actually present. In a true watermark, you have areas where there's more fiber and less fiber, and that's why you get the pattern when you shine a light through it. When you emboss it, you don't change the amount of paper which is present, you just thin it out a little bit in some areas. Sometimes that means that you barely can see the watermark when you hold it up to a light. Other times, in the case of this one, it'll mean that where the paper is pressed down and made thinner, actually a little bit more light does get through, so that you see these lines here as light lines rather than anything else. So let's see how those look when you have light shining through them. There's the genuine watermark. Now it's a lot more easy to see an elephant's head here with a big ear and a bit long trunk. And there's the counterfeit watermark. And actually where the paper was pressed, where the paper was compressed, it's a little bit darker. It's passing less light because it's a little bit denser there than in the rest of the paper. But it's not a very good rendition of that watermark. So holding it up to a light doesn't really give you a good impression of this fake watermark. It's best left alone on the table like this. And of course, you don't see it this closely when it's sitting on a table or being passed hand to hand. You simply glance at the note and you see, oh yeah, there's something there in that watermark window, and therefore I'll accept it. Now here's another post-war note from Indonesia. The genuine note is intaglio in two colors, orange and brown, and this is what we call a progressive intaglio. It's not from two plates. It's printed on a press that allows you to selectively ink one area of the plate in orange and one area of the plate in brown. And then where those two inks come together, you get a transition range where the orange turns gradually to brown. It's actually fairly sudden here. It's not very gradual. Some progressive intaglio take a space of several millimeters to change their color. In this case, it's a fairly swift change of color from orange to brown, all the way down. And you can see here in the signature that you've got orange over here, brown here, and you've got a mixture right in here. There are several security features in this note. One is a watermark right up here. The other is a security thread. This is the counterfeit down below, and they had to do something with the watermark and do something with the security thread. Well, with the security thread, they actually printed it on the note. Now you can see on the genuine note here, you can see a little bit of a shadow here where light is coming in from this side, hitting a ridge where that thread is embedded in the paper and creating a little bit of a shadow on this side. And that goes all the way up to the top of the note. You can trace that thread all the way up to the top without holding it up to the light, as long as you know where to look for it. It's not real obvious. In the counterfeit, they printed in light gray ink a line going all the way across the paper to simulate that security thread. Now, what did they do about the watermark? In the genuine note, the watermark is bold enough that you can see elements of it here without actually holding it up to the light. This is a tabletop photograph here on a light stand with no light coming from behind the note. There's what it looks like when it's illuminated from behind. A spread eagle, and here's that security thread now showing boldly because there's light coming through from behind the thread. In the counterfeit, the watermark is even more bold, and you can certainly see the thread where that light gray ink was printed. So how did they make this even more bold than the genuine piece? By printing on the back of the note. Here's the back, and you can see in this pale gray ink that we already saw for the security thread, the eagle design with the shield on the breast. And over here on the back, they also printed a security thread. Now that means that they made this thread on the back line up perfectly with the thread on the face. Because when we looked at it over here, we didn't see two threads. We only see one thread. That's very good printing, that they made that line, face and back, align with each other so you only get a single line when you hold it up to the light. Here's a note which is all Intaglio except for the seals and serials, which are letterpress. And the security feature in this, in addition to the Intaglio, is silk threads in the paper. You can see blue threads here, and there are some red threads scattered around in there as well. I don't see any red ones actually appearing in this part of the photograph. If we go back to this one, we might be able to find some red ones. Hard to tell, but there are two colors of threads. Alright, there's a red one right there, and there's a red one over here. So we got two colors of threads in the note. The counterfeit note is letterpress, and if we blow this up, you can actually see the ridges along the edges of these lines, which are the diagnostic feature of letterpress ink that got pushed out to the edges of the image when the paper and the inked plate were brought together. And we've got threads in the paper. Now, how are these threads replicated? They're done with colored pencils. They take a red pencil and a blue pencil and just sit there and draw random threads on the note wherever you want the threads to be. Now, they apparently had some people who don't really understand the random nature of threads in paper, because these don't really look very random. They're fairly parallel. And in this one here, it's really bad. The kid who was assigned to draw these things on this note for the counterfeiting family probably got sent to bed with no supper that night, because this is not deceptive at all. And you can see up there, there's actually an inverted 8 in this serial number up here. There's an upside down 8 in that serial number. Military payment certificates. MPC were for use only by U.S. authorized personnel, mostly U.S., sometimes allies. For instance, Canadians used them in Germany. And in Vietnam, all of the allies used MPC. This is the second series of MPC. It was issued in Europe and in the Pacific. Must have been 1946 or early 47. Yeah, it had to have been 47 at least, because of Series 471. So it's the first series ordered in 1947. The security feature in MPC are planchettes. Planchettes are little paper discs embedded in the paper. So there's a red one, here's a blue one, there's a blue one over here, another pink one here. There's a almost invisible one, which is truly embedded in the paper. You can see that better if you held it up to a light and you would see a dark spot there, a dark disc, because the planchette is actually completely inside the fibers of the paper in both directions. Here's a red one over here. This is the easiest series of MPC to counterfeit because the planchettes are the same color as the note. The note itself is blue or blue-green and red, and the planchettes are blue and red. So you can put the planchettes in the same plates as you're printing your counterfeit from. So down here we've got the counterfeit that didn't do a very good job with planchettes. There are very few planchettes in this image. I found some last night. There's a blue one right there. I think we'll see a red one on the back when we look at the back of the note. But this counterfeiter didn't put very many images of planchettes in his note. I should have picked them up by photography, because these are photographic processes that are used to copy these notes, not digital, film photography back in the day. And the planchettes should have been visible on the surface of the paper as they were up here. But since the planchettes are in fact random, it's possible to find a note with very few planchettes in it, and that must have been what he was photographing. So other than the planchettes, and of course the serial number font, which is not correct. Let's see, we don't have a 5 up here, but does not match this 5 here. The 2s match. The 6s are pretty close, so he really did a pretty good job matching the serial number font. These numbers are position numbers on the sheet when the note was printed. They're not block numbers. They're actually they link together with the serial number. If you know how many notes are printed in a production run, and you know where the position 8 was on the sheet, you can actually calculate a serial number from that. It'll tell you which production run was actually the one that was used to create this particular note. So counterfeiters didn't understand that. So if you know the math, you can frequently determine a counterfeit note by determining that the serial number and the position number don't go together. They don't compute together. Now, what other security feature do we have on these? Well, here's the genuine note planchettes, and you see it's fairly well printed. They've got the blue tint inside these frames. You go over here to the counterfeit piece, he sort of misaligned this, so you don't get that quite there. There's a red planchette on the back. The other security feature was ultraviolet reactive inks. This was a classified secret process that was begun with MPCs. Every series of MPCs has ultraviolet reaction. Generally, the serial numbers turn brown. In this case, through these photographic processes that I use to make this. It doesn't look as brown as it looks green, but it's sort of a dull olive green. One of the two tints, there are two blue tints on this. One is blue and one is yellow blue or blue green. And one of them is UV reactive. They're not both UV reactive. The 10 over here turned brown, and the $10 up here turned brown, which is what we would expect the serial numbers to do. But they're not printed in the same path through the press, so the inks do not match. And of course this text here will turn brown as well. The counterfeit shows no UV reactivity. This is the counterfeit photographed under ultraviolet, and absolutely zilch. But the counterfeiters didn't even know about these features of MPCs. And as I said, it was a classified bit of information. Finance officers knew about it. Not very many finance officers had a UV lamp readily at hand, but if you got to a high enough headquarters and you had a note that was suspicious, you could throw it under UV and see whether it in fact showed any kind of reactivity. All right, we're moving along in time. This is an Iranian note post-Shah. They overprinted this big calligraphy seal here over the watermark window to hide the Shah's watermark. They were still using the watermark paper with the Shah and the watermark after they had removed the Shah from the artwork. And during the Iran-Iraq War, before Gulf War I, when Iran and Iraq fought each other for several years with lots of casualties, the Iraqis were counterfeiting the Iranian notes. Well, these are the genuine note is Intaglio in multicolors, printed in Europe someplace, possibly Switzerland or in Germany, and then brought into Iran. They probably put this on after they got them into Iran. I don't know if those were printed at the print plant or if those were applied after the notes arrived in Iran. If they were printed at the print plant, they would have changed the paper. They would have taken the Shah out of the paper. So here's the Iraqi counterfeit. It's not Intaglio, it's lithographed. You can see that the quality of the image is noticeably inferior. Now, what did they do about the fact that this has tactile texture? It has the Intaglio texture that you can feel with your fingers, and what they were printing was perfectly flat. Well, they embossed the images of the face into the back with a metallic dye and high pressure, the same way that we already saw embossing being done on that watermark from the Laotian note. This was embossed from the back so that the embossed image pokes out on the front and gives the impression then of an Intaglio texture. After Gulf War I, when Iraq was embargoed and Iraq could not get its own notes out of Europe, they used the same process on their own notes to make their notes seem to be better than they really were, to make the notes seem like they were a higher quality, that they were in fact Intaglio printed, when in fact they were not Intaglio printed. Here we have an Italian note with lots of security features. There's a watermark over here in two different modes. We'll see those in a minute. There's a mylar thread in here. There's a metallic thread over here. This is all Intaglio. This is OVI, optically variable ink, color changing ink. And we've got something we haven't seen yet down here called see-through registration. So let's look and see how all of those were used on the genuine and the counterfeit notes. This is a counterfeit note that has been opened up. somebody has torn the note here and pulled the thread partly out. That's the metallic thread. This is in the paper of the counterfeit. The counterfeit has all the same security features that the genuine has. It has watermarks in 2 modes. It has 2 threads. The only thing it doesn't have is intaglio printing. On the genuine note, all of this red and all of this brown is intaglio. On the counterfeit note, it is not. But all the other security features are present in the paper of this note. That's a really high-class counterfeiting operation. Here's a genuine note. There's the mylar thread with the letters in it that say Banca d'Italia, and the metallic thread over here. This is a watermark right here, 3 vertical bars. It doesn't represent anything in particular. It's possible that it represents the denomination. I'm not sure if other denominations had a different watermark of that nature. There's a head over here, the same head that we have on the note, and this is called an electrotype watermark. It's always in very bright white like this. The paper is quite thin where that electrotype watermark is. The black and white watermarks, the ones with the variable texture, if you will, are made on, when the paper is made, the watermark screen has this image in the watermark screen. This image is actually a die which is welded to the paper screen, which is why it stands up so high and creates this very light image. The IB there is Banca d'Italia. That's the logo of the Bank of Italy. Now over here we have that see-through registration I was talking about. If you remember when we looked at the note not illuminated from the rear, this was incomplete. There's only 4 leaves on this stem. When we go back over here to illuminated from the back, you can see that there are 3 more leaves, but those are printed on the back of the note in perfect registration so that they align with the stem. This see-through registration can only be printed on a press that prints both sides of the note at the same time. You have it's an offset. This is offset lithography, and you have the image on a lithographic plate, which is then transferred to a rubber blanket, in this case a rubber roller, and then transferred to the paper off from the rubber roller. And you've got 2 rollers face to face with the paper passing between them, printing the face and the back simultaneously in perfect alignment. Now, how did the counterfeiter do with these? Here's the counterfeit. It's got the same watermark here, not quite as well executed. It's got a real mylar thread in the paper, a real metallic thread in the paper. It's got the simulated watermark. I mean, this is a real watermark as well, but it's probably not done with an electrotype die. It's whatever process they used to create this one, they threw this one in at the same time. And you can see that the see-through registration is not quite as well aligned. There's the genuine and there's the counterfeit, and this leaf here is a little bit low. This leaf is actually overlapping the stem, and this one's too low on the stem. So these guys didn't have the high security press that would print both sides at the same time. They had to print their notes one side at a time, print the back and then the face, or print the face and then the back, and do their best to align these. So they didn't quite make it on that that one element. You can see the difference in the quality of the intaglio to the lithographed of the main vignettes. But with all those security features in the paper, you saw that somebody had actually opened up that well-circulated piece to expose the thread to prove, yes, this is actually in there. And somebody else later drew that black crayon mark across it to cancel the note, saying, yeah, it's there, but it's not legit. Here we have another example of see-through registration and something else we haven't seen yet, which is an interrupted thread. This is a thread that's in the paper all the way top to bottom to top, but in some areas it pokes through the paper, and in other areas it's buried in the paper. You can see the fiber that the paper is made of being exposed there at the places where the thread comes out of the paper. Think about a sea serpent, you know, going up and down through the water. So parts of it are visible and parts of it are not visible, but that thread it goes all the way up. You can see the shadows here on the side where that thread actually is embedded in that paper. This down here is embossing from the other side where it says Banque von Belgique in intaglio, heavy intaglio, and the embossing in the back is because this paper got pushed into that engraved plate when that was printed. Over here we've got the see-through registration element, and it's only got well, it's got three colors on here: a dark violet, a mauve, and this pale violet here. And the rest of that is printed on the other side of the note. The counterfeiter used stick-on tin foil. He took little pieces of aluminum foil and glued them onto the note. This counterfeiter made no effort to replicate the parts of the thread that are in between the areas where you can see. He didn't print anything on there. Some counterfeiters print in pale gray a line connecting these all the way up so that it looks, when you hold it up to the light, like a continuous thread. This counterfeiter didn't bother with that. And there's his see-through element. And this is a cancellation hole over here. And we don't see any evidence of embossing. Well, the embossing that you're seeing here is actually from the photographic plate that they made from the original note. You can see how crude this is, comparing the text here, which is completely illegible, with the text here, which is the name of one of the artists who worked on this note. Now we're illuminating from the back. So we're looking at light coming through this note. There's the genuine. You can see the note is continuous, or the thread is continuous, and it's a little bit brighter here. You see it's more legible where it's showing through the paper, where it's actually coming out of the paper. And you see this ladder effect here of light, dark, light, dark, light, dark. Where it's light is where you can see the thread coming out of the paper, because the paper is physically thinner, and the thread shows through in ordinary hand-to-hand use. And the rest of the areas where the paper is thicker, the thread is invisible. There's the see-through registration now. You've got green on the other side of the note, filling up the spaces that were empty earlier, and they've got very good registration. And here's the counterfeit. No evidence of any thread connecting these visible elements of the thread, and the see-through registration is really wretched. So this is not a very good counterfeit of this note, but it did get out into circulation. Alright, here's a Russian piece, which in the genuine piece is intaglio. This is intaglio. We have a watermark over here, which the counterfeiter has to do something about. There's a counterfeit that was says exchange denied when it went through when the notes were withdrawn and exchange for new money. This note was identified as a counterfeit, and the exchange was not allowed. Now there's the watermark in the genuine note, and you can see also threads in the paper. You can see threads here in several places. There's the watermark in the counterfeit note. It's a real watermark. It's a genuine watermark in the paper, not on the paper. And it also has silk threads in the paper. Now this same paper was used by at least 2 counterfeiting rings, because I have 2 different counterfeits using this same watermark and thread embedded paper. Here's what that note looks like under ultraviolet. Here's the genuine. We've got ultraviolet reactivity on this element and this element here, some up in here, and the threads glow green and red. And these are not necessarily the same threads that you saw on the surface of the paper. They've got multiple kinds of threads mixed into the slurry when this paper is made, and some of them are reactive under UV and some are not. Some are just there to be seen in white light by the person who's holding it in his hand. You throw it under UV and more threads show up. That's the other side of this note, and we have the threads and this big blue ball up here. It's a bright blue in real life. It doesn't photograph as a real bright blue. So we've got threads and that blue ball. Here are the 2 different counterfeits made on that same fake paper. Whoever was making that paper specifically for this note sold it to more than one counterfeiting operation. They've got different fonts in the serial number. There's different quality in the image. You see a little bit more contrast, bolder image up there than we have down here. This looks a lot more muddy. But they're both on exactly the same paper. Here's what they look like under UV. We've got the UV here, the UV here, the UV here, and the UV in the threads. That's, a very good replication of the paper. No blue ball. This counterfeiter forgot to put the blue ball on there. This counterfeiter put it in. So there's the second counterfeit. And there's the face of that same note with the blue ball present. Now, one thing these guys didn't do right is that these threads are a lot longer than the threads in the genuine note. So they don't really match the length of the threads is noticeably different. But they managed to cover most of the bases. This pair of notes here is the first time I ever encountered a counterfeit using ultraviolet. I'd never seen ultraviolet inks been used on a counterfeit until I got this pair of notes. I don't remember, well, 1993 was when they were issued. 93, I was in Seattle. I got these notes probably around 2000, around the year 2000. So at that point, counterfeiters had tumbled to the fact that ultraviolet was going to be a feature in notes, and they better try to do something to replicate it, and they did. Canada. This is the last of the pre-polymer paper notes. We have gold maple leaves down here. There's the genuine note. You don't see any gold maple leaves. That's because the gold maple leaves are printed in what's called pearl ink. It's transparent when you're looking at it head on. When you're illuminating it from directly onto the paper, you don't see the reflection from that pearl ink. This one is simulating the pearl ink. The advantage of this is you can't copy that on a photocopier because the camera won't see it. The lens doesn't see that pearl ink. Here we've got light reflecting off of it from an angle, and you can see the gold on the pearl ink. Here's the counterfeit, and it's on there as well. Well, if you put this under UV, you discover that the UV can't see this either, but the UV certainly does see this. There's the genuine note under UV, and you see all this coat of arms and text over here, which were completely invisible without the ultraviolet. But you don't see the gold leaves. And there's the counterfeit, and they turn black under UV. So they're very visible. They duplicated all this, but they didn't figure out a way to deal with these under ultraviolet. And if you know how this works, the fact that you can see it under any lighting condition, also tells you that there's something wrong with it. The Bank of Canada stopped using that ink. It's not cheap, and they found that people were not paying any attention to the treatment. How you would look at this note from an angle and see if you could see the gold leaves. They saw them here, they didn't see them here, and they apparently made no difference. The public wasn't using that feature to separate good notes from bad. Now here's the micro printing on the genuine note. And you can read every word here all the way down in English and French. And there's the micro printing on the fake note, and it's really wretched. You lose it about halfway down. This is what's called a Skit note. It's designed to look like one of the British white notes, 50 pounds, dated 1816. Remind us this is all for fun. That's the end of that slide set. Now I'm going to stop sharing here and then restart sharing. Alright, this is the slide set on official counterfeiting. This is government against government counterfeiting. This is not commercial counterfeiting. It's not criminal counterfeiting. It's one government making the notes of another government with ulterior motives. Of course, there was government against government counterfeiting in coinage from time immemorial. I don't know how far back you'd have to go to find the first instance of one political regime counterfeiting the notes of some other political regime. But in paper money, the earliest counterfeit paper money that I'm aware of that's government on government is the American Revolution. These notes, this is a genuine Continental currency $60 note dated 1778. The Continental currency notes began in 1775 with low denominations, a third of a dollar, a half a dollar, $1, $2, $7, $8. But as the years went by, and it wasn't very many years, this is only 4 years later, they were putting out $60 and $70 and $50 notes because of the inflation that had occurred with the Continental currency. Because that was the only money that the revolutionaries had. There was practically the British government had never sent gold and silver coinage to the colonies. They once in a while sent some copper coinage. All the silver coinage that was in the colonies came from Latin America, from trade, and it was in the form of Spanish milled dollars. You can see that that's what this is payable in. This bill entitles the bearer to receive 60 Spanish milled dollars, or the value thereof in gold or silver. Good luck trying to find any of that. According to a resolution passed by Congress at Philadelphia, September 26, 1778. Now look at the fonts that are in use here. Really weird fonts. Franklin brought back from England 2 or 3 fonts that were very unusual. It did not exist anywhere else in the colonies, and he used that for some of the notes that he printed. He was printing notes for several of the colonies and the Continental Congress. By the time we got to these, he was not in the business of printing notes anymore. We'll look and see on the other side here. It tells us. Yeah, Hall and Sellers were printing the notes in 1778. But the form of the letters, the mix of the fonts, you got ordinary font, you got all dollars, you got italics, all mixed in together here, which makes it hard for the common counterfeiter to reproduce this stuff, because not very many print shops had this range of fonts available. I have 2 signatures on here. In this case it's Snowden and Gamble. Now, because the Tories were counterfeiting these notes, when the British began to counterfeit the continental currency and circulate it, with the intent of both diluting the value of the currency and destroying the public confidence in the currency, they began to print what's called counterfeit detectors. Well, I mean, next slide. There's the back. The leaf printing, the nature printing on the back of this does not show up very well at all on this particular denomination. Other denominations, you have leaves, real leaves that fell from trees that have been converted into a type plate, a type die that can be used to print the notes. And the veins on those leaves were the counterfeit deterrent. It was very difficult to replicate the veins on a natural leaf on a counterfeit note. In this case, we don't see that very well at all. Here's the counterfeit detector note. It's printed from the same plate as this one up here. It's on gray paper and has no serial number and no signatures, and the fact that it's on gray paper was supposed to make it unpassable. You know, merchants would know that if a gray paper note showed up in somebody's hand with signatures and numbers, it was a fraud. That it was not genuine, not original, and should not be accepted. So the counterfeit detector notes were circulated to banks and merchants to use as comparison pieces to a note that might come in that's a counterfeit. Now here we have a pair. The one on top is genuine, the one on the bottom is the counterfeit. The distinctions are very subtle. We have a dotted I here and a dotted I here. In the genuine note, this I is a little bit to the left of the one above it. Down here in this word Congress, this S goes all the way up, turns the corner, and starts to come down a little bit on the other side. These are the diagnostics that were published in the period to merchants and banks to be able to identify these notes in the absence of a counterfeit detector. They would be told to look at the I in milled and the I in received and see if it aligns a little bit to the left down below. On the counterfeit, the one down below is to the right. It's considerably to the right. And the S in Congress never turns the corner. It comes up and just stops here and doesn't turn down. So those are the 2 published diagnostics for this date and this denomination. Every date and denomination that was counterfeited had these diagnostics published. And you can find today in the, well, now I can't remember, it's Paper Money of Early America by Newman. It's in his 4th edition. And in the back of the book is a section on counterfeits, and it publishes all these diagnostics. Now here we have a second counterfeit that has the same problems. In fact, it's the same counterfeit. I mean, it's from the same counterfeit operation. It's to the right and not turned down. But check the signatures here. We've got Snowden and Gamble up here. We've got Snowden and Gamble down here. That's sort of unusual, you know, to be able to match a pair like that, because there were many signers of these Continental notes, and being able to match up signatures is, you know, a fool's errand. It's just pure coincidence that I happen to have a counterfeit that has the same 2 signatures as the genuine. And you can see that they aren't the same hand. You know, the person who wrote Gamble here was not the same guy who wrote Gamble up here. And the one who wrote Snowden here wasn't the signer down here. So in the absence of the diagnostics, you could also compare signatures if you had a known genuine note in hand that you could actually compare it with, and if the piece in hand had the same 2 guys signing, because there were many pairs of people that were signing these notes. Alright, moves to the next revolution, the French Revolution. Just a few years after, just a little over a decade after our revolution, the French went through the same agony. They issued what are called assignats based on the national lands. The lands were confiscated from the church and from a few nobles, and the land was used as the basis for the currency. It was the backing for the currency. So you didn't have gold or silver backing these paper notes. You had physical land backing the notes. And that was how the notes were identified as assignats of the national domain. Now I can see that we're hitting an hour here right now. Is that right, Logan? Are we already an hour into this?
Yes, sir, we are.
All right, so take 5 minutes. At the end of 5 minutes, come back and we'll continue with these government against government counterfeits. Let's continue working on these French Revolution pieces called assignats. Can you hear me, Logan?
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay, fine. All right, these are letterpress on paper that has an embossed seal in 2 places and a watermark. So there's the face. Here's with cross lighting. You can see that there's a fairly elaborate seal here on the left end and on the right. Didn't take very well down here. Took a little bit better up here. And when we look at it, there's the back. It's blank on the back. This one's endorsed by somebody for some reason. With light coming through it, you can see that the paper is thicker up here where those seals are supposed to be. And you actually could see that effect here, that the seal took a little better up here than it did down here where the paper was thinner. And there's a watermark, R-E-P period, F-R-A-N-C period, for République Française. The British, who were at odds with the French off and on for centuries, were supporting, one side against another in this revolution. Of course, the British were a monarchical government, and they were in favor of the monarchy. They were not in favor of the revolutionaries in France. They counterfeited these notes in the Netherlands, in a town called Dordrecht. So this note was one of the counterfeits, which was found and identified as a counterfeit and stamped. First it was handwritten, F-A-U-X, and then Dordrecht over here in script, and then rubber stamped, Faux, Dordrecht, to identify it as a bad note coming from that counterfeiting operation. Well, let's see how well the counterfeiter did. There's the seal on the counterfeit note, the two seals. You can see that they're pretty well done. Same blank back. Same watermark. You've got the thicker paper here to take the seals, and you've got the REP, FRANC down here. A little bit off center. This is a little bit lower on the note than on the other one, but it's all there. In the text, you can see that the counterfeit actually looks a little bit better than the genuine piece. The printing and the legibility of the text is a little bit better on the counterfeit than on the one above. The XXV here represents the denomination, 25 livres. When we go down to the bottom of the note, now we have the counterfeit beneath. Again, especially on this end, the counterfeit is more legible. Over here too. Now look at this. This is apparently some French folks, I don't know, presumably these are revolutionaries, because they're confronting some soldiers over here. They're recognizable as soldiers because of the helmets. Down here on the counterfeit, you might be able to make some soldiers out of that, but what do you make out of this? It looks like a bunch of ghosts. The counterfeit really falls down in this artwork here, and I don't understand why, because it shouldn't have been that difficult to create some artwork that looked more like that. Especially since the rest of the counterfeit, the printing and everything, seems to be superior. But it is what it is. Now, a few years after that, Napoleon is marching on Moscow. And Napoleon is counterfeiting the Russian notes. This is a Russian assignat. Same word. I don't know what the Russians were using to back up their assignats, whether they were also using land or if they were using something else, or just plain old, here it is, use it, like it or lump it. This is a very crude note in letterpress with 3 serial numbers, one here, one up here, and one down here. A very tiny denomination here, 10, supported by this large denomination counter in text and in words over here. Now, these were counterfeited by the French. I don't have one of the counterfeits. My understanding is that the counterfeits are not hand signed. These are signed in ink, in manuscript, face and back. There's the back, and there's an endorsement on the back, also in manuscript. My understanding is that the French counterfeits printed these signatures. But I've seen, this one you can see is A9 alpha, which means it is genuine, because if it were with counterfeit, it would be A9 alpha X. So here we've got a genuine piece, but I've seen ones slabbed as counterfeits that seem to have hand-signed signatures, and I've seen ones slabbed as genuine which seem to have printed signatures. You can see the embossing on the back of the signature coming through from the other side. You can see the embossing here of all the printing coming through from the other side, but the signatures are soaking through. The ink is soaking through the paper there and here under this third signature. There's evidence of that second signature on the face. So I'm still looking for another piece. I have a 25 ruble piece that's allegedly genuine with autograph signatures, holographic signatures, and I'm waiting to find a match for it that's going to have printed signatures. I haven't been able to find one yet. And Napoleon, this is another case of government against government, counterfeiting notes. Now we're all the way down, we're 50 years beyond Napoleon to our Civil War. Here's a Type 16 $50 note, 1861. It's been canceled. These cutouts here are cancellation marks. These notes were withdrawn and reissued in new series several times during the Civil War. If you look up here on the left-hand end, it says fundable in, I think it's 4% stock. There's 8% stock. Yeah, fundable in 8% stock or bonds. I can't make out this text here. Then Richmond, Virginia. Fundable means that you could trade this in for an 8% bond. And several times the Confederate government called in the notes and reissued bonds to replace them because they wanted to reduce the amount of circulating currency and keep inflation under control. And sometimes you had your choice about whether to take the bond, sometimes you didn't. But what we're going to see is a counterfeit of this note. Now check down here and see the fine detail down here, the rays above the 50 and the little ornaments on both sides. Okay, here's a counterfeit of that same note. And you can see that this element down here is much more crude than the one we just looked at. The one we just looked at was lithographed. This one is printed from a woodblock. It's a woodblock print. Now way down here, off the note, it says facsimile Confederate note. These were printed by a guy named Sam Upham in Philadelphia. He was printing these initially to sell to Northerners who wanted to have examples of what the Confederate currency looked like. You know, souvenirs or they didn't have any theme parks then, but this is the kind of stuff you find at theme parks these days. So he was reprinting these notes from wood blocks and sometimes from lithography in his shop in Philadelphia. And he put these labels on them indicating that it wasn't an original note. It wasn't a genuine stolen from the Confederates note. When he found out that people were buying these and shipping them through the mails to relatives in the South, so the guys in the South could use them, and they were cutting off these little caveats, he stopped using the caveats. Now here we have one where it's cut away. Notice back here we had no signatures and no serial numbers on this note. This is the one we looked at first. It's an incomplete piece. Still has the facsimile caveat attached. Here we have one that has a hand-signed signatures, 2 of them, and handwritten serial numbers, and the caveat has been cut away. Now this signature here was frequently used by Upham on his notes. So he had somebody in his shop who was signing this T. Ellett signature, and he then began to print the T. Ellett signature. Now this one has the full imprint. Facsimile Confederate notes sold wholesale and retail by S.C. Upham, 403 Chestnut Street, Philadelphia. I guess that's 408 Chestnut Street, Philadelphia. The signatures are both printed. Now, this is a dead giveaway. Once this is removed, no Confederate notes were issued with printed signatures except at the end of the war, the 50-cent notes had printed signatures. That's the only Confederate notes that had printed signatures. All the others were signed by female clerks for the register and for the treasurer. Notice this serial number here, 3312. That's also printed. Printed serial numbers were almost never used on Confederate notes. They were all handwritten. Now here we have the same note with no imprint. Once he figured out that people were cutting the imprints off, he just left them off himself. It's the same serial, the same signatures. When we lay them next to each other, you can see that they match, chapter and verse, except for the imprint, which has been removed. Now, you could say, well, this isn't a government against government operation, because this guy was doing this for commercial purposes. That's true, but the feds turned a blind eye. They didn't shut him down. So he continued doing this throughout the war, and as far as the feds were concerned, anything you could do to mess with the South was good. As far as they were concerned, have at it. So you can consider it to be a subtle government against government operation. Now we're moving on again to World War I. This is an Ottoman note. The Turkish Empire, the Ottoman Empire, was aligned with the Germans during World War I against the Central Powers. Wait a minute, which side was this? I'm always confused about which side were the Central Powers, but at any rate, we didn't have Allied and Axis there. We had Central Powers and some other group whose name I'm not recalling. That's what happens when you get to be in your 70s. This note is a counterfeit prepared by the British of the Ottoman note. 10 livres in Ottoman currency. I don't know where they were intending to use these. The British had lots of troops fighting Ottomans in the Eastern Mediterranean. I mean, I'm sure you've heard about the Dardanelles campaign, Gallipoli. Those were all Ottoman troops defending against the British coming over the beaches there. So there were plenty of opportunities for the British to use Ottoman currency. And they printed these. I don't know who they issued them to. The distinguishing feature in the print part of it is the arrangement of these counters. You notice that 10, that one dot, that's 10 in Arabic, 10 in Western, and one dot in Arabic again. Read the opposite way from over here. Here you're reading from the outside in. Over here you're reading from the inside out. So these have been switched around. Now why would they make a dumb mistake like that? Counterfeiters like to sign their work. It's an axiom that in virtually all counterfeits you can find some distinguishing feature that was left wrong intentionally by the counterfeiter. So that when he's laundering his money and he's trading it for good cash, he doesn't end up taking his own product back in exchange for the money he's trying to launder. So, what the British would be doing, taking any Ottoman currency back, who knows? But I'm sure that that was an intentional introduction of an inconspicuous error that the counterfeiter would know about, but the general public would go right by. Now the real issue here is that the genuine notes had these watermarks. This is a German paper. This watermark appeared in German notes after the war during the Great Inflation. So these Ottoman notes were probably printed at the Reichsdruckerei in Berlin. As I said, they were allies. And the British note had no watermark in it at all. So why they would bother marking, I suppose if they don't want to call attention to the fact that they don't have watermarks in their notes, they don't want to see people holding them up to the light, that they would put the more inconspicuous defect on it, but that was the way it was done. All right, now we come to the Grand Master of counterfeiting against another government. This is the German operation called Operation Bernard, for the name of the officer who was in charge of the operation, Bernard Kruger, a lieutenant colonel in the SS, to counterfeit British white notes, 5, 10, 20, and 50-pound notes, to be used for several purposes. One, the Germans always needed cash during the war to buy war material, to buy raw materials, to pay off other governments that they were allied with. So that was where they used their best of the white notes that they created. The second tier notes were used to pay their spies. The guy named Cicero, the code name Cicero, in the German consulate in, I can't remember, it was Ankara or some other town in Turkey, who purloined classified British documents out of Hugh Knatschbull's safe, was paid in these notes, and ended up taking them to Argentina and coming to a bad end because they were identified as Nazi counterfeits in his hands. The third tier of quality, they were just going to dump over the British Isles and disrupt the currency in circulation. Now, it's impossible for a counterfeiter, even an industrial level counterfeiter like the Germans, to overtake or swamp a circulating currency. The government that put these things out in the first place has too much of a head start. There's no way that you can print enough of these things to actually bring the currency down by dilution. But you can certainly try to bring it down by reputation. And that, in fact, happened in Madrid, where a lot of Spain was neutral, and you had both Allied and Axis supporting movements in Madrid. And the Germans were laundering a lot of these notes through Madrid. And when it became known that the notes that the Germans were bringing in were bad, the exchange offices in Madrid wouldn't take any white notes, because they couldn't tell the good from the bad. So they just said, no, we just won't handle them. So that's how you really get to affect a currency, is by destroying people's faith in the currency. Now, this is a very simple note. The printing is all letterpress. I was astounded when I learned that. I saw a picture of a plate that had been recovered from Toplitz, and I said, that's a letterpress plate. And it's in reverse image, which means they were printing from that plate. So what's going on here? And I got out some magnification capability and looked at the notes and discovered, by golly, they're not engraved. The original white notes back at the beginning of the 18th century, 19th century, were engraved. End of the 18th, beginning of the 19th. They were engraved on copper plates. In the middle of the 19th century, the British discovered that they could reproduce plates using electrolytic deposition, and so they began, they stopped using engraved plates. They started using letterpress plates that they were making electrolytically. Why they stopped at letterpress, I don't know, because you can go one more step and make an intaglio plate from a letterpress master. But they didn't. They continued to print letterpress notes from the middle of the 19th century all the way into the 1950s. before they stopped using letterpress as a printing technology. Now the backs of these notes are blank, and you can see the watermark is very conspicuous here. That was one of the tough things they had to master. They had to figure out how to replicate that watermark, and they also had to figure out how to replicate the paper, because the cash handlers in Europe, the major banks, had ultraviolet illumination available to them, and they discovered that notes were coming through that didn't have the same ultraviolet reactivity that the white notes had, that the British created notes had. So the Germans knew that they had to replicate that paper to the degree that it would react the same under UV as the genuine paper. And that took them a while to master, but they did. And they turned out millions of pounds worth of these notes. Well, there are ways that you can separate them, that you can tell the good from the bad. This is a genuine note. You can see how bold the watermark is. This line coming up to the N of England on a genuine note is somewhere on the left side. It can be a little bit offset left, or it can be all the way out on the corner like this one is, but it's never right dead center in the bottom of that triangle. This one is one of the German counterfeits, and that comes right up dead center. Now, not all Bernard notes do that. Some Bernard notes also come up here at the corner. So you can't use this. If it looks like this, it's a Bernard. But if it's somewhere out here, you don't know whether it's a Bernard or a genuine until you look at something else. So we're going to look at this area of the medallion, right around here, this area of the medallion, and then we're going to look at this word of, not on the 5 pounds, because what I'm going to show you on the word of only works on 10 and 20 pound notes. All right, so there's a genuine piece that doesn't go all the way out to the corner. There's a genuine piece that's somewhat offset to the left. And there's the counterfeit that we just looked at. Now, this little leaf coming out of this ornamental design here, on the genuine note, this line cuts back across this line here. It cuts across up into the veins of this leaf up there above it. And the counterfeit, generally, almost always, it comes up here and rejoins and continues on out and does not cut across. Now this can be ambiguous. You can find ones that you can't quite determine, does it cut or not cut the line to go up. They don't all come up as far as that one does. That one goes up across 3 lines, or that touches the 3rd line above the edge, but they don't all go up quite that far. So then we go up here into the gown. On the genuine notes, the edge of the gown here is all these little pointy lines, dots, very irregular. On the counterfeit note, you get a solid line down here. Now you can have, a couple of lines down here which match these here, but even they don't look the same. They're not as irregular and composed of a bunch of little dots, because these are solid lines here. So that's your 3rd level of detection. Pam West likes to see an earring in Britannia. Unfortunately, sometimes on a counterfeit note, such as this one is, it looks like there's an earring there. So I don't find the earring to be a reliable indicator. It's another one you can look for, but many counterfeit notes do not have an earring, but not all do not have the earring. Now, on the of, we're going to look at right here, this little line right here. On the genuine 10s and 20s, this is a wedge-shaped line. It kind of starts out narrow and gets wide, quite wide by the time you get up to the top. On the counterfeit, it looks like this. Now you can't use that on the 50s because the 50s, the counterfeit 50s come both ways. They come with the wedge or without the wedge. You can't use it on the 5s because the 5s don't have the same calligraphy for the word of. They don't use this kind of an F in that location, so you can't use it on the 5s. But the 10s and 20s, in my experience, this is a reliable indicator. That's genuine, and this is not. Now sometimes a 10 or a 20 does get a little wider, but it doesn't get that wide. This is what, 3 times, 4 times as thick here as it is down here. It might get twice as thick, but it doesn't get, it's usually like this, and sometimes a little bit thicker, but not wide. It's not a real wedge. Okay, moving on. In 1942, late 41, Japan invaded southeastern China around Hong Kong and captured the print plant where these notes were being made at the Datung Printing Company outside Hong Kong, over on the mainland across from Hong Kong. Datung was printing these notes for the Bank of Communications. There were 4 semi-official banks in China. There was no central bank in China. There was a bank just called the Central Bank of China, but it was not. It was a commercial bank. The 4 banks in China whose notes were acceptable in international commerce were the Central Bank, the Farmers Bank, the Bank of China, and the Bank of Communications, which is what this note is from. So the Japanese captured this plant, lock, stock, and barrel. And this note was exchangeable in foreign trade, so they said, well, we need foreign exchange, so let's keep printing these notes for ourselves. But instead of continuing to print right there on the scene, they disassembled the plant and took it to Tokyo and set it up there. By the time they got finished with that, almost 2 years later, the value of the Chinese yuan, the nationalist Chinese yuan, had fallen so far that these notes were worthless. So all that effort was for naught. So they intended to print these and use them as Chinese currency, but ended up being a lost cause. Now, counterfeiters like to sign their work. I expect that someday we will find a diagnostic in the notes that were printed in Japan to distinguish them from the notes that were printed in China. That hasn't happened yet. What we do have, let's look at the back of this note briefly. We have a lot of notes that have these rubber stamps on them. These rubber stamps are printer's waste. The notes are printer's waste. The stamps say the printing of the engraved plate is bad, or the printing of the lithograph plates is bad, or we also find them with mismatched serial numbers, where the serial numbers on the face and back don't match. Notice back here that you've got the same serial numbers on the back. These are not the same note, obviously. So, where did these come from? They got lost after the war. I don't know whether they were lost in China or lost in Japan, and came out in the 1970s or 80s with all these rubber stamps on them. Frequently, the note that has the stamp has no visible defect. You can't see why, if the note says the engraved plate was poor, you don't find any defect in the engraved printing. I suspect that the notes were stamped while in sheet form. They just, ran across the whole sheet and stamped every note. And then they went into a bin or a carton or something and hid away for decades until somebody found them and trickled them into the market. So now you find them all over. They have red stamps, violet stamps, can't remember if there are any green or blue stamps. But all the notes that have those stamps on them are printer's waste. And we may someday be able to distinguish between the Japanese and the Chinese printings of that note. Same period. This one's a little bit earlier. The note was issued a little bit earlier. It was still circulating at the time of World War II. Legal tender in Burma only. It's a Government of India note, but overprinted for use in Burma. Now, we know now what blocks were used by this issuer for these notes. They were most of block 88 and all of block 89 and all of block 90. And then the letters, A through Z, before you rotate to a new number. This next note was sent to me as a counterfeit. As I say, at the time I bought this, we didn't know what numbers. Now we'd know immediately that 77 was never used for Burma. So this has to be a bad overprint. So this is an overprint that was done by somebody else at some other time. When we get to, well, here's the watermark in the genuine note. Here's the watermark in the note that was sold to me as a counterfeit. You can see it's qualitatively different, but watermarks are, by their nature, variable. So this didn't condemn it by itself. When I got to the back of the note, here's the back of the genuine note. It has a variegated tint. This is a lithograph tint. It goes from green to violet to green. And the counterfeit, the alleged counterfeit, has the same kind of tint, from green to violet to green. Remember when I talked about this on the Indonesian note? Those variegated colors, be they intaglio or lithograph, those you don't get in your local print shop where you get your yard sale signs printed and your church flyers published. That's a security press. Somebody, whoever printed this note, had a high security press and was doing this kind of work. So who would that have been? Well, the story that came with the note was it was the Russians. Why would the Russians be counterfeiting Burmese currency? Because the Burmese rupee was tied to sterling, and sterling was a hard currency, which meant that this rupee was hard currency. So it was useful in international trade to have notes that were sterling linked. The Russians were known to have counterfeited other people's money in the same period. The U.S. hundreds, the large size hundreds that were circulated in the early 1930s out of Berlin were printed under Russian auspices. They actually were printed in Berlin, but it was Russian operation. The Imperial Bank of Canada hundreds that came out of the Middle East actually circulated fairly widely also in Russia from Persian merchants. There's speculation that the Russians were behind that, but it's never been proven. A thesis that was written on that subject in 1970 concluded that it was probably a criminal operation, not a government operation. But his caveat was the Russians have never opened their records, so we can't determine whether, to what extent the Russians were involved. Certainly Russian agents were moving those notes, but we don't know that they originated the notes. So the Russians are highly suspect for this, but again, there's no evidence. All we know is that whoever did this was not a low-level criminal operation. It was a high-level governmental sponsored operation. Now, when I challenged the dealer about the fact that this had this kind of a tint on the back, what makes him think it's a counterfeit? He says, well, I have another one that's falling apart. You want to see that too? And I said, absolutely. And he sent me the one that was falling apart. And here's how this note was made. This is the watermark pasted. It's a some kind of a pasty substance printed or applied or put on with a wood block inside the note between the two pieces of paper. So you didn't have to replicate the paper, the watermark in the paper. All you had to do was replicate the printing after manufacturing the paper with this fake watermark inside it. Now, a little bit after that, I found this at the Colorado Springs Coin Club show during summer seminar one year. This really ugly horse-face version of George V. I said, that can't be legitimate. Do you have another note of this issue? And by golly, he did, and here it is. Well, unknown to me at the time, this red legal tender in Burma only is in the wrong place. It belongs up here. So this counterfeiter put it where the black one was originally, put his red one where the black one was, and didn't put it in the margins where it belonged. But you can see that this is also the laminated paper, because you can see where the paper is separating here. Instead of being uniformly thick all the way across, this circulation line here, some paper has been lost. Some paper has been lost up here. Some paper has been lost up here. So this is another laminated note, even though it's not opening up like that one, like the 5 was. This was created the same way. Now we get to the U.S. involvement in state-on-state counterfeiting. We had guerrillas operating behind the lines in the Philippines during World War II. They needed cash. They needed money to spend. And they didn't have any readily available way to get it. They couldn't go into a Japanese paymaster's office and say, hands up, give us your notes, because they would have been wiped out. So MacArthur's headquarters in Australia wired Washington and said, please counterfeit the Japanese invasion money. And after it was ready and delivered into Australia, it was taken over to the Philippines and delivered across the beaches to the guerrillas to use for fighting the war during World War II. Now, this was the first series of JIM for the Philippines. JIM is Japanese invasion money. It's all lithographed, easy to counterfeit. It's on watermark paper, so you do have to replicate it to the greatest extent possible, because if the Japanese find people carrying known counterfeit notes, it's off at their heads. And that was literal in World War II. The Japanese took off lots of heads. Every NCO and officer carried a sword, and those swords were lethal weapons. So the guys in Washington had to figure out a way to replicate this paper, and they did. They found a source of paper in the U.S. made from the same fibers that the Japanese paper was made. They pulped it and made new paper from the pulp and put the watermark in it to replicate the watermark of the genuine pieces. I believe, next slide. Well, all right, you're going to see the watermark a little later. All right, here's the 50 centavo piece. This little line right here has a gap in it in the counterfeit. That's the U.S. Army counterfeit of the 50 centavo. In the 1 peso, you have these veins in this leaf in the upper left corner of the face, all separated. On the counterfeit, 2 of those veins are joined. These are really subtle distinctions. On the 5 peso, these curved lines never join this outer curve. They stay separated all the way to their ends. In the counterfeit, they join the outer curve. And on the 10, on the genuine, you have nothing in this little valley here. This is on the top left of the back. And in the top left of the back on the counterfeit, you got this little dot here sticking up above the center of the valley. We had known that, well, it had been rumored that these had been counterfeited for a long time, but we had no evidence until finally the MacArthur Library in Norfolk opened, and all of MacArthur's archives were in there, and we found copies of the letter asking for these to be made, and another letter going back to the Philippines saying, this is what you provided us, this is what we made. And we were able to find these identifying marks on 2 of the notes. 2 of the denominations were in that correspondence. The other 2 have been identified by association. When you find 4 of these notes all folded together, and 2 of them are counterfeits, and the other 2 have these other distinguishing features, we conclude that the other 2 are also counterfeits. Somebody who was handling these things during the war set aside a set of them for himself, and there was 1 of each denomination. And it was by association that we confirmed the diagnostics on the other 2 denominations. Now, there were other troops operating behind the lines in other areas. We had a team in Burma. They also had cohorts in Malaya. They requested both of these series be counterfeited. Now, this one's all lithographed, so it's easy to counterfeit. It's on the same paper as the Philippines. This was an OSS operation, Office of Strategic Services. MacArthur's was an Army operation. OSS was subordinate to the Navy. So OSS was asking the Navy to counterfeit these notes. MacArthur was asking the War Department to counterfeit the notes. They never talked to each other that we're aware of. The 2 guys, responsible for counterfeiting the Army and the OSS didn't coordinate. But someplace that coordination happened because the printing is on the same paper. It's the same style. It's all the same kind of product. So when you finally get to the printing level, these 2 operations merge. But in the operational level, they were separate throughout the war. This is an intaglio face. So an intaglio plate had to be prepared for the face of this note. And later, the Netherlands East Indies notes, it also had an intaglio face. Now there's the watermark that had to be replicated. It's a 4-lobed floral ornament that we call a quatrefoil. The Japanese call it a cloud, or clouds, plural. And it repeats throughout the note. And here we have the British counterfeit for this operation. They did not use watermark paper. They didn't have our paper. This is the genuine note. You can see the watermark repeating on this margin. And this is the British Special Operations Executive counterfeit of that note on somewhat heavier paper, a little bit more dense, and no watermark. It's mottled, but there's no distinct watermark in it. Here's the British counterfeit of the Burma 10 rupee. Again, the same mottled paper, but no discernible identifiable watermark. Here's their $1 for the Malaya. This is the only piece known to collectors. It came from the Nielsen collection. It had tape on it here at one time, and the tape residue has left the paper translucent there. So this is the part of the paper we're looking at on both sides of that tape translucency. And there's the SOE, Special Operations Executive, counterfeit of the Malaya $10, again with the mottled paper but no watermark. This is the back of these notes. There's an ocean scene here. I don't recall which is which here. The diagnostics are not visible in that slide, so let's move to this one. You can see that the 10 rupee and the $10 have what appears to be the same back, except for the 10 rupee and the ocean scene. So when they went to counterfeit the Malayan piece, they had already done the Burmese piece. Our troops were physically in Burma, and so that was the first type that was counterfeited, and they sent several crates of these notes out to the Burmese, the team operating there, to be airdropped into them by parachute. And later they did this note, and they took the same back and stripped out the 10 rupee and inserted this. Not knowing or not caring, we don't know which, that these two in fact are not identical. Let's see here. Okay. You see this little arch right here? That's what we call the low arch or the Burma arch. And when you get down here, it's a high arch or the Malayan arch. So when they counterfeited the Malayan notes, they used the Burma frame. And that's a way that we can identify the counterfeit Malayan pieces, because they have the frame of the Burma pieces. Now here's one of the first two of our Malayan pieces that was discovered. I found two of these one day in Bill Henderson's stock in a stack of these $10 junk box notes. I was looking for no watermark notes, and what I found was the note that had the diagnostic on it that identified it as an OSS counterfeit, and it was one of the high points in my numismatic career. There's the Burma arch on that note that we just saw a picture of. And there's the Malay arch that it should have had on it. Now there's also a distinction in this gutter here. The Japanese notes have a little tick mark in that gutter. On the Burma pieces, this tick can be that length or it can be double that length. We don't know why the Japanese had two different sizes of the tick mark in their notes, but they did. But they never had ones with no tick mark there. And that's what this is. We removed that tick mark. Counterfeiters sign their work. That was one of the distinguishing features that we intentionally put in. Now here we've got the Japanese Burma piece and a US piece with no tick mark in it, but it's a very weird piece. It's on a parchment-like paper, heavier and crisper than usual, and with orange blocks. I found 3 of these in one shop in Mercer Island, Washington one day. There's never been another one discovered that I'm aware of. The only thing I can conclude is that this is a proof note, or something that they were working on leading to the counterfeits of this note. It had the plate that indicated it was an OSS counterfeit, but it had the wrong color block and the wrong substance to the paper. It is watermarked. It has the proper watermark in it, but the paper feels like light parchment. Now this piece was found in a Singapore junk box by a friend of mine in Japan, a Japanese collector, who sent me a scan of it and said, "Can you read these names for me?" Because he couldn't make out the calligraphy of the handwritten U.S. signatures. Well, the first name I saw was Lee E. Eccles, and I said, "Boy, I know who Lee Eccles is. He was a shooter on the Border Patrol pistol team before the war." Ted Simpson I didn't know, Irwin Cohn I didn't know, but then when you turn the note sideways, what have we got here? Colonel C.F. Eifler. Well, Colonel Eifler was the commander of Team 101. Here's his request for counterfeiting of money. Wants rupees and Malay dollars. And there's his signature. So that note was signed by Eifler and sent back to the States to his shooting buddy. Eifler was also a shooter. So I emailed my friend back and I said, "Well, look at the back. Tell me if it's got the Burma gutter, the OSS gutter." And he said, "Well, I never thought about that." And sure enough, it doesn't have the tick mark in the gutter. So this was a counterfeit that Eifler ordered and then had in hand, signed, sent back to the States to his buddy Eccles, who wrote this book. And there's that fancy signature that we saw on the note. That's Lee Eccles' autograph. And on page 69, if I can get this thing to advance too far, there's Ted Simpson, one of the names on the note. The other guy turned out to be a friend of Simpson's in the Dallas Border Patrol office after the war, and no relation to Eifler or Eccles. But Eifler, Eccles, and Simpson were all shooters before the war. Okay, we've run out of time. We're not quite finished with Malaya and Burma. Can I keep going, Logan?
Sure. We can give it maybe 15 or 20 more minutes.
Okay. Eccles also asked, not Eccles, Eifler also asked for NEI notes to be counterfeited. Now you can see it's the same faceplate as the Malaya, except for the legends. We had been looking for a counterfeit of the NEI for a long time, because we knew that Eifler had ordered them. But there was no documentation in the records we got out of the CIA with a FOIA request to show that they'd actually been printed. We didn't know, if any of it had actually been produced. Then, let's see here, what have we got? All right. You can see that we have the high arch here. We have a high arch here. And not shown yet. Still in the same. Okay. This note showed up. A little smudge above the smoke out on the horizon. The SOE, when the SOE did their Malay notes, they were identified by the Japanese as being smokeless. This is a Japanese piece here. If we go back here far enough, we can find a Malay piece that has a very attenuated smoke plume on it. Like that one. There we go. Alright, that's why this was in here. I forgot why this slide was in here. That's the Japanese smoke plume. That's the SOE, the English smoke plume. Now it's actually there, but it's very reduced. It's not nearly as conspicuous. And the Japanese had identified this as a counterfeit. The Japanese knew this note was being inserted into the economy from someplace other than themselves, and that it was a counterfeit of the Malaya $10. So when we got to working on looking for the counterfeit Netherlands East Indies notes, and found this one with the smudge. This note came out of the Netherlands, and it turns out to be a fairly common piece. I've picked 3 or 4 of them out of junk boxes, and there was a single lot of 147 pieces in the Japanese Destiny collection that was auctioned by Lynn Knight of notes that came out of MacArthur's headquarters. Well, we looked at this, and it had a watermark in it. We said, all right, that means it's not SOE, so it must be US, and it had the high arch on it. And I said to myself, okay, they finally got their act together, and they replaced this frame with the proper frame. They're no longer using the Burma arch here, they're using the high arch. And we attributed this to the OSS, to the US operation, because it was watermarked. And the SOE had never been known to use watermarks. There's the watermark in it. Well, then lo and behold, up comes, there's the Japanese piece and the piece with the smudge over the smoke. At MPC Fest about 5 years ago, in comes one of our festers with a double set of all the counterfeits of World War II Jim. He'd bought it on eBay. The seller had no clue. Whoever had assembled that set obviously was gathering examples of all the US counterfeits and the British counterfeits that were used for Jim in the Pacific. And in that set was an NEI piece with the Burma arch. We'd never seen the Burma arch on an NEI piece before. And so now, it throws everything into a cocked hat. Okay, if the OSS did this one, then who did the other one? The one with ink smudge on it. Well, there's the Burma arch, and there's the open gutter. There is the watermark is in it. It's again very hard to make out, just the same as the Malaya pieces that the OSS did. The watermark is hard to see, and this note is cut too close. The margins are too narrow, so that's another problem with this note. It's not only a counterfeit, but it's cut a little bit small. But this lady's book, says that the British counterfeited the NEI notes on proper paper. Now, she didn't say specifically that it was watermarked, but it seems as if we finally shared our paper with the British, and that the British counterfeited the note that has the smudge over the smoke, and that this note that has the Burma arch was the one that we created with the OSS. So it's not a lead pipe cinch that the SOE did the one with the smudge over the smoke, but my guess is that they tried to fix the smoke. They knew they'd screwed it up on the Malaya piece, so they tried to strengthen the smoke, and in the process of doing that, created that little smudge over the top where it didn't belong. Okay, so we've finished with the Jim. I think we can go ahead and quit here. There's several other examples of government against government counterfeiting, but any questions come in on the chat?
I don't have any, but I can give it a few seconds. If anyone has any questions, you can put them in the Q&A or the chat so that I can read them to Joe. What about USA and the Vietnam War?
Well, we did counterfeit notes of North Vietnam as propaganda leaflets, and we scattered tons of them, literally tons of them, over North Vietnam. But they're further along in this talk. We're still only up to World War II. So next time I teach one of these, which I've applied for a third installation in this e-learning series, we'll pick up here where we left off and get to those.
All right, I don't see any other questions, so thank you very much. It was a very educational and a learning experience for me, and I'm sure everyone else who had a pleasure of watching it. And for all of the attendees, we hope that you will be on some more of our e-learning in the future. Everyone have a great night.